So, on the one hand, we are beginning to see this shift in American public discourse among the population. You even have former President Jimmy Carter coming out with, a book criticizing U.S. support for Israel. You have relatively mainstream political scientists like Mearsheimer and Walt who are primarily concerned about U.S. power talking about this openly. And you even have shows as mainstream as The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, which had excellent coverage on the situation in Gaza. Yet on the other hand, in terms of the actual situation on the ground, it's worsening by the day, and to use your words, we are witnessing the death of a nation. What can be done to bridge that gap? We're beginning to see a shift here, but this is not being reflected at all in official policy. Do you think that we actually are in a position where we might be beginning to penetrate actual policy?
Well, I mean, the fact is, Israel apart, there's a vast gap between public opinion and public policy on all sorts of issues. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's why 80% of the public says the government is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves, not for the people, and 95% that say the government should pay some attention to public opinion but doesn't. And if you run through issues, on issue after issue, the political class and the interests their own constituency, which is mainly the corporate sector, and for Obama, the financial institutions, there's just a tremendous gap on policy. That's true on domestic policies like healthcare. It's true on Iran. It just runs across the line. And the problem is the lack of functioning democracy in the United States. I mean, in a functioning democracy, the government represents the people. Well, in a non-functioning democracy, the government makes policies, gives instructions, and the people either don't like it or they follow the instructions. And unfortunately, we're sort of toward that end of the spectrum of possible democracies. It's not all that different from Europe, but somewhat. So I think the question is right here. Can public opinion influence policy? Now, in fact, the public doesn't really know much about this issue or even care much about it because the coverage is so awful. Yeah. But still, a considerable majority of the public for years has favored the Arab League plan, which is it goes beyond the international consensus, calls for normalization of relations. But as in many other cases, public opinion does not influence policy. So take the examples you mentioned. Jimmy Carter did write a book by, say, European or Israeli standards. It's kind of like a moderate book. Actually, he had one important discovery in it, not discovery to people who follow these things, but for the public. Namely, he did point out that for the first time in print, that mainstream print, that Israel had flatly rejected the roadmap, mm-hmm. which is quite crucial because one of the charges against Hamas is they don't accept past agreements. But Israel agreed to the roadmap, but it instantly attached 14 reservations, which eliminated. And he talked about it in the book. He even had an appendix, and I noticed that no review that I saw ever mentioned it, because this is it's not tolerable. Yeah. And if you look at the Democratic Convention, he was not allowed to speak. Here's a person who's sort of moderate, kind of like in the mainstream, but too extreme for the Democrats. Mm-hmm. Jon Stewart, I don't know. I don't watch television, but so, take what you say, I'm sure is right. But it's still right at the periphery. Mm-hmm. I mean, the media accept almost unquestioningly the U.S.-Israeli position, which is not unusual. They almost always accept the U.S. position, which in this case happens to coincide with the Israeli position. Yeah. So you have an article from, say, yesterday in the New York Times, front page article on measuring the gains in Gaza or something like that. How much did Israel gain by it? I mean, when Russia crushed Chechnya, you didn't have a front page article saying, well, how much did Russia gain from this? I mean, were the losses worse than the gains or something? But here you just kind of reflexively, it's not just journalism, the whole intellectual community, you kind of reflexively are loyal to state power, state and private power. I mean, you criticize things. Like say, take Obama. Obama is always described, even on the left, as having a principled opposition to the Iraq war. What was this principled opposition? He said it's what he called a strategic blunder. It's too harmful to ourselves. We should be fighting another war. And that's kind of like, that's as principled as German generals after Stalingrad who said we shouldn't have fought a two-front war. Or if you look at the Russian press in the 1980s, there are plenty of that kind of criticism of the invasion of Afghanistan. It's sort of a blunder, it's costing us too much, we shouldn't have done it. It's totally unprincipled. But in our context, it's considered principled because any deviation from conformity to state power is kind of shocking. You're supposed to conform. But that's the educated classes, the political class, the corporate sector, of course, which largely staffs the government anyway. And how do we change that? Well, it has to be changed the way it's always been done. I mean, there have been changes. There's a lot of progress in the country. I mean, I don't happen to like any of the candidates, but the fact that the Democratic Party had two candidates, a woman and an African American, that's pretty interesting. I mean, it couldn't happen 40 years ago. It couldn't happen 20 years ago. But it shows that the country is slowly becoming more civilized. And we know what it comes from. I mean, in this case, it comes from student activism in the 60s, which then proliferated, had a big effect. The feminist movement came along in the 70s, the environmental movement, the solidarity movements, international. I mean, take the ships trying to go to Gaza. That's the result of the development of a solidarity movement. Things like those ships were going to Vietnam in the 1960s, to break the American blockade. These are changes. They're slow, but that's the way changes take place. That's why we have the rights and privileges we have. They were never given from above.
All right. Professor Chomsky, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.